As researchers, as policymakers, as consumers, farmers, climate activists, and food citizens, we face a confluence of serious crises facing our food and agricultural systems. Across very distinct geographic, cultural, and ecological contexts, the challenges of designing sustainable food systems are remarkably similar. Inequitable access to land, contested knowledge about how to feed the world while cooling the planet, and high levels of uncertainty on how to adapt to changing markets, reshape consumer dietary preferences, and address climate change are likely top of mind for most of us in this room. But these concerns are not new. Decades after the Green Revolution, almost 1 billion people in our globe are undernourished, and our food system is one of the biggest global threats, exacerbating climate change and biodiversity loss. Agricultural chemicals create occupational health hazards for farm workers. They contribute to the 6th global biodiversity extinction, and synthetic fertilizers contribute to water contamination and the loss of soil biology. We also have a globalized problem of democracy and governance. Economic concentration in global agri-food systems has led to a very small set of decision makers exerting enormous influence over markets, seeds, agricultural inputs, and agriculture and land use policy. In response, food movements across the globe in both rural and urban areas are developing creative, context-specific solutions to food systems crises. But these movements often lack material resources, supportive institutions, and they lack political opportunities to exercise their agency to scale up their proposed solutions. So these facts speak to a confluence of crisis increasingly characterized as a wicked set of interlocked social and ecological problems in the food system. So to the question this morning of whether we should focus on rural or urban or both, I work with a lot of natural scientists who point out that we live on one Earth and that climate change affects almost every aspect of our lives. Climate scientists predict an ever-decreasing safe operating space for the food and agricultural systems that sustain us, no matter where we live or work. The actions that people and institutions take along the food supply chain contribute to a feedback loop where we continually have to respond to changing social and ecological processes induced by climate change. And as a result, at least 85% of the global population lives in an area affected by climate change. This is expected to rise, and the disruptions to our food supply chains, both from climate change and political change, as we're currently seeing, are increasingly frequent. As just one component of this safe operating space, climate change and other human-induced landscape transformations have brought us to the brink of a 6th great extinction, with significant feedback loops not only for climate change but also for human food security, but also for many other aspects of traditional ecological knowledge, biocultural heritage, and other socio-cultural aspects of both rural and urban life. Despite living in the world with record-producing harvests and fantastically innovative agricultural technology and research, such as much of what is coming out of laboratories at my own institution and institutions like Wageningen, we are currently witnessing rapidly rising levels of food insecurity and malnutrition once again. From a systems perspective focused on the human right to food, these unacceptable levels of food insecurity have to be considered as not just an issue of production, or as simply related to improving supply or value distribution chains, or even as a problem primarily related to the lack of technological or social innovations. Rather, the cross-cutting issues of food insecurity and climate change are contemporary outcomes of a complex socio-ecological system that represents intersecting social, economic, cultural, geographic, political, and ecological relations. So beyond simple interpretations of these problems as relating to insufficient innovation, food security and climate injustice, and by that I mean the disproportionate impact of climate change on marginalized populations, require attention to the distribution of both benefits and risks under the current conjuncture, and also to the reasons why many already existing solutions, many of which require the redistribution of risks and benefits and resources, are not being implemented. This, above all, is a social rather than a technical problem, and one that the field of rural sociology is well equipped to work on. So as one example, we know that food insecurity, vulnerability to climate change, and loss of biodiversity and biocultural heritage are all clearly correlated with poverty and social inequality, much of which is mediated by race, class, and gender, all issues of great concern to rural sociologists and increasingly to global citizens and policymakers. We saw this sharply in the last couple of years, where food insecurity dynamics mediated by social inequality were exacerbated by the pandemic. So who is responsible? Why, with all that we now know in the centuries since the scientific revolution and the Green Revolution, decades since the Green Revolution, have our research, academic institutions, and the policies that come from them failed to create a healthy food system that feeds people and sustains the planet? So who is responsible for climate and food security? What actions should be taken, and by whom? And who will benefit from those actions? Who will not? And particularly relevant for us today in our discussions about the future of rural sociology, what analytical frameworks will help identify the processes related to reproducing or changing social structure and opportunities to exercise agency to best get global society on stronger footing for a food secure and climate resilient future? So to proceed, we need to address a problem that is often less visible in these discussions. It's an ontological and epistemological problem of knowledge politics, one that is power-laden, potentially more dangerous than climate change itself, and more influential than any one technological or political solution to addressing this confluence of crisis. In working on these questions, my research group seeks to explore different ways of knowing, different ways of being, and different ways of acting in the food system, focusing particularly on the agroecological transitions for social and ecological justice. So I work with several concepts as part of an interdisciplinary team involving both social and natural scientists with several shared principles. The first is epistemological pluralism. This means having a better understanding of and appreciation for different ways of knowing about food and agriculture. This isn't just about research. It has to do with learning new ways to communicate ideas with each other and to appreciate and engage with different disciplines, methodologies, sectors, geographies, cultures, using a systems approach to resolve food systems problems. Now, working with other disciplines has become pretty commonplace in rural sociology and food and agriculture studies in general, and we've gotten better at it. Rural sociologists have been on the forefront of an implied and community-based approach to interdisciplinarity, or what is increasingly called transdisciplinarity, for several decades. That said, if we take seriously the practice of epistemological pluralism, there is a next challenge. Ontological harmonization involves ensuring consonance, not just between different ways of knowing, but beginning to translate how these different approaches and their varying intersections might influence the shape of different ways of being that we want to see in the world. And our debates and discussions must take into consideration whether creating outcome improvements for one sector or way of life doesn't unduly harm the ontological position of other actors, social groups, or positionalities in the food system, including that of non-human actors. So this way of working begins to assert ontological equity as a criteria for taking action in practice and in policy. So most of the work I'm doing these days falls into the field of agroecology, where we can really start to see how these principles work out or don't work out in practice. So agroecology is characterized as a science, as a practice, and as a social movement. As a science, agroecological scholars like me draw on rural and environmental sociology, agronomy, gender studies, political science, ecology, and many other disciplines to understand how agriculture and food systems as socio-ecological living entities structured by social and ecological processes. As a set of practices, agroecology involves a series of production-related activities, whether those happen in the city or in the countryside, based on the idea of a socio-ecological metabolism and circular economy, with the focusing on the recycling of nutrients between society and nature. As a social movement, agroecology has been associated with the food sovereignty movement as a way to rethink the way that we work in harmony with, instead of trying to control, nature's processes. Yet the science, practices, and social movement potential of agroecology are all contested. On the one hand, many researchers suggest that agroecological transitions are necessary to feed the world equitably while also mitigating and adapting to climate change. On the other hand, there's serious resistance to and co-optation of many of the practices and discourses associated with agroecology. As this quote from Kip Tom, the previous US ambassador to the FAO and the World Food Program, argued as he critiqued the European agroecology movement as kind of ineffective. So coming back to our question, what role do rural sociologists have to play in working towards climate and food security? What are the roles for rural people and urban people? And can agroecological transitions bridge this metabolic rift? So we all well know we live in an increasingly urbanized world, and by 2050, over 2/3 of the global population will live in cities. When I think of some of the central problems in rural sociology, access to land, land tenure, the role of women in farm economic reproduction, the issue of rural farm viability and livelihoods, adoption and diffusion of technological innovations in agriculture, globalization, trade liberalization, neoliberalism, and their effects for rural peoples and agricultural production systems. I could go on. These are all problems influenced by processes, structures, institutions, decisions, and actors that are increasingly acting in urban areas by urban people and in relation to processes of urbanization as it affects these broader dynamics. So for many years, the fundamental problematique in rural sociology was understanding what happens in the countryside. This is often presumed analytically a systems boundary that sees the urban as an other, sometimes acting upon a rural space and sometimes a recipient of food products from it. Cities are important only as they encroach on this rural land through sprawl or serve as target markets for rural produce or serve as the void into which migrants leaving the countryside disappear. Yet clearly our current climate and food security crisis isn't just a rural or agricultural issue. These issues affect all global citizens no matter where they are physically, epistemologically, or ontologically positioned. Both rural and urban people, across many different positionalities, institutions, and with differing levels of access to resources and power, participate in the ontological decision about what is the problem and what is the solution. We see competing narratives from governments politically accountable to both urban and rural people, and from food citizens involved in activism around both supply and demand side solutions, both in the country and the city. So all of this is by way of summarizing the main point that I'll make today, that rural sociologists are uniquely positioned to address this confluence of crisis. We sit at the intersection of rural and urban systems, as I've just described. If we take advantage of our training in systems approaches to research, our capacity and interest in interdisciplinarity, our deep history of community engaged and participatory research, and our close attention to socioecological dynamics in food systems. So I'll conclude by illustrating these points using examples from some of the work I've been doing on agroecological networks that take a fresh approach to resolving socioecological and metabolic crises using a really different approach to food and agrarian citizenship by connecting rural and urban networks. So in the mid-19th century, Karl Marx explained the concept of a socioecological exchange or metabolism as a dynamic and interdependent process linking society to nature through labor. So members of society appropriate the materials of nature through labor. In the process, we transform the environment, and simultaneously we transform our own human nature. So we grow. The socioecological metabolism in agriculture is maintained over time and space through the recycling of nutrients. Formerly and often small-scale local agricultural initiatives take nutrients from the soil in the form of food, fodder, and fiber, later replenishing soil fertility with waste to ensure continued productivity. So Marx argued that the processes of industrialization and urbanization associated with capitalism created an artificial separation or an antagonism between town and country. Agriculture became, instead of a mechanism for socioecological reproduction, it became a mechanism for food security defined as cheap calories for low-wage workers, with rural livelihoods threatened by a continual race to the bottom of agricultural commodity prices and environmental degradation. and nutrients were no longer recycled. Instead, they were brought in by ship, bat guano from places like the Galapagos, or were manufactured in post-war weapons factories. The maintenance of an analytical rift between the study of rural and urban could be argued to, in fact, be predicated on the preservation of the metabolic rift, maintaining a separation both between rural and urban processes and social and ecological processes. But in the late 1990s, environmental sociologist John Bellamy Foster reignited sociological interest in the metabolic rift, reminding us that the rift, metabolic rift, or rifts, since theory has proliferated on the kinds of rifts that we are now seeing, represented a growing ontological space between the city and the country, driven by even more extensive processes of urbanization and industrialization, which manifest as open nutrient loops. This manifests in intergenerational dispossession from land. It manifests in alienation as a result of social disengagement with the process of creating human sustenance. This process of both individual and community alienation from land, labor, community, and political enfranchisement resulted not only in the loss of the means of production, but also in increasing distance or loss of critical consciousness between rural producers and urban consumers. So in sum, the theory of the socio-ecological metabolism is now a thriving framework in rural and environmental sociology and food system studies. And we have many studies now that help us understand better what is happening when we see the disembedding of social and personal relationships within a community. What happens, why is it that we see a growing incidence of dispossession, inequality, and social and economic and political inequity as capitalism, financialization, land grabbing, and the concentration of decision makers in the global food system constrain choices for both farmers and consumers? We also see what can be done about it. So one of the rifts that has been identified is that of a knowledge rift, both a practical knowledge rift and an epistemic one. So the knowledge rift has to do with, as people have left the countryside, they've literally forgotten how to do things like grow food, or they've forgotten how to do things like cook food. They have had an intergenerational break in the transmission of knowledge about how food systems work. So addressing the knowledge rift isn't just about training people to farm with new technology or training students in new interdisciplinary programs, but it's also about finding new ways to engage youth in the city to engage with food systems. This doesn't necessarily mean that everybody needs to start growing lettuce. This can happen in many different ways in urban food systems, apprenticeship programs, food literacy programs, and redistributing land and resources to a more diverse set of food systems actors. As part of the project team for last year's HLPE report on youth engagement and employment in agriculture and food systems, we found that access to material resources, particularly land, and not lack of access to technology or knowledge, was the biggest barrier to generational renewal in farming populations across the globe. So we need to get beyond an information deficit model of addressing knowledge to get to more the epistemic level of how knowledge is owned, shared, and transmitted between people, rather than simply thinking, oh, we need new knowledge and we need to do research to get that knowledge. So this network in Canada, called the Young Agrarians, is one really good example of that. They're working on sharing knowledge between the country and the city and between different kinds of farmers. They work on land matching and apprenticeship for new and beginning farmers from urban areas. They connect with agroecological training programs and urban marketing cooperatives to close the loop between city and country, and they offer both material and epistemic connections between these different social actors. Agroecological programs also engage in youth education in farm-to-school programs from even elementary school and high school, such as this one that we've looked at in Canada. And also, another example in our work is the seed sovereignty and agroecology markets in the city, such as this one in Ecuador, who work with a broad organization of solidarity economy in the city, where agroecological producers from the countryside are brought into constant conversation with people in the city. And that conversation involves more than just buying and selling products. It involves sharing biocultural knowledge, it involves political advocacy, and it involves solidarity when material resources are needed in the countryside. So as a final example, participatory certification programs have become a new pathway towards connecting agroecological producers, including new and beginning farmers, and those transitioning to agroecology. These organizations are actively involving urban consumer groups in policy advocacy to increase support for land access and land protection in rural areas in particular. These urban people are engaged in developing diverse market pathways, including community-supported agriculture. They're involved in developing shared food processing and distribution facilities, and they're also building solidarity networks with food insecure people in cities. So the Rede Ecovida or Eco-Life network in southern Brazil is one such example, promoting short food supply chains across southern Brazil with almost 5,000 farmers involved in diversifying both their own production systems and also their marketing strategies across a broad range of urban centers. Your own colleague here, Jandawi, has theorized that social groups such as these, which he and others characterize as social carriers, can help overcome socio-structural barriers and promote sustainability through a strategy to promote territorial autonomy. The idea is that the construction of these kinds of urban-rural relations reduces dependency on external inputs, resources, and actors, and instead helps rely more reliably on place-based socioecological relationships, resources, and economies. As a result, these networks can be an important sustainability driver, connecting benefits across diverse positionalities in both the country and the city. So Rede Ecovida involves many partner NGOs and social movements, including an organization called Sapagro, an urban-based network in Santa Catarina that I've worked with since 2015. Sapagro coordinates participatory agroecological certification networks in the region, and they also organize peer-to-peer knowledge sharing between new and transitioning farmers, both within the region and with national and international partners. That same organization also organizes interactions with urban consumer networks, including in urban agriculture and food literacy activities in the city, and in agroecological extension and cooperative marketing in the countryside. The key point here is there are many opportunities where rural and urban people now are getting together physically, materially, socially, and involving and sharing knowledge back and forth. Sapagro also works with neighborhood-level organizations in nutrient recycling, starting urban compost and nutrient management programs where food waste is literally returned to the countryside. So in this work, our key observation has been to show how agroecological networks bring urban and rural networks back into metabolic dialogue in order to shift power and transition to more sustainable food systems. These organizations are involved in metabolic repair to address both food security and climate change. I appreciated this banner at one of the farmers markets that I went to recently in Brazil involving agroecological producers, focusing on both flavor and health. So this work translates into political action, food that crosses the rural-urban divide. Food donations are coupled with food literacy and advocacy during the pandemic. Here we have examples of lots of food donations coming into the city. And this political action also translates into climate advocacy, where these agroecological networks are responding to extreme weather events in Brazil this last winter by, again, creating the epistemic link between climate change, food systems development, and the need for political repair. So in summary, this work on agroecological transitions has shown how repairing the metabolic rift has involved ontological harmonization between country and city, and epistemological pluralism in how people, and by people here we include farmers, consumers, researchers, policymakers, how we all see and talk about pathways to action for sustainable food systems. Our work has shown that by looking at the city and the country as part of one food system rather than as objects kind of bumping into each other from time to time, we can identify points of entry to study opportunities and constraints for both social structure and human agency, and how these intersect to influence agroecological transitions. So in conclusion, the act of producing food is a political act. It involves rebuilding relationships with the state and with consumers and with the land itself. I'm glad to be trained in rural sociology so that I can be involved in this work as an embodiment of my own politics. So I'm very happy to have questions and discussion, and I want to thank you for your attention.